The world as it once was, full of bustling cities, advanced technology, and millions of people, had long since faded into a distant memory. Earth was no longer the thriving planet it once had been. Now it was a hushed, empty land, scarred by war, disease, and environmental collapse. The last human civilization had crumbled under the weight of its own failures, and only a handful of survivors remained. They struggled to survive in a world that had been abandoned by the very thing that had created it. Humankind. In the wake of humanity's downfall, the cities had fallen silent. The once towering skyscrapers now stood as hollow husks, their glass. Windows shattered, their iron skeletons rusting. The air, once filled with the hum of everyday life, now only carried the whispers of the past. The air was thick with dust, and the streets, once alive with cars, now held only the echoes of forgotten voices. It was a bleak and quiet existence for the few who remained. There were no leaders, no governments, only survivors trying to make it through each day. The creatures who roamed the desolate lands were often more dangerous than the environments themselves, as wild animals had grown bolder and more unpredictable without the human presence to keep them in check. But there was one thing these survivors could rely on: hope. There was a story that had circulated in the isolated remnants of human settlements, stories of an underground military complex hidden deep beneath the Earth's surface. It was said to house weapons, tools, and perhaps most intriguingly super soldiers, genetically enhanced humans created during the darkest days of the war that had wiped out most of the planet's population. The protagonist, one of the last survivors of humanity, had heard these stories. Unlike others who were too afraid to venture into the wasteland, they had always been curious. In the depths of their heart, they had believed that the stories might not be just myths. They might hold the key to a future that could rebuild the world. One day, with nothing left to lose, the survivor set out on a journey toward the old military complex. The landscape was harsh, and the journey was dangerous. The path was treacherous, filled with wild animals, deadly terrain, and the ever-present threat of other survivors who had become as dangerous as the predators themselves. But the survivor was determined. They believed that this place held the answer and perhaps a chance to bring back what had been lost. For days, they wandered through the broken land. The journey was long, and there were moments when they wondered if it was all in vain. Yet, the thought of what could lie ahead kept them moving forward. There were no other choices left. The world was on its last breath. If the soldiers were real, then perhaps they could be humanity's salvation. After what felt like an eternity, the survivor reached the outskirts of a vast underground facility. It was hidden deep in the mountains, cleverly concealed from any prying eyes. As they approached, their heart raced with anticipation. They had no idea what to expect, just the faint hope that they had come to the right place. The entrance to the complex was buried beneath layers of rock and soil, but there were signs of human activity. The survivor carefully searched the area and found a narrow shaft leading underground. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They descended into the depths, their mind racing with possibilities. The walls of the complex were cold and damp, and the air felt stale, like it hadn't been touched by human presence in centuries. The sounds of their footsteps echoed eerily. Through the corridors, the silence almost deafening. There were no guards, no security systems, just empty halls lined with old machinery. Everything had been left untouched for so long that it almost felt like the world had forgotten this place existed. As they moved deeper into the facility, the survivor began to find signs of something else, something more intriguing. They stumbled upon a large chamber filled with rows of cryogenic pods. The pods were connected to machines that still hummed with a faint life. It was clear that the facility had been meant to house something important. And it didn't take long. for the survivor to realize what those pods contained. The super soldiers. They were frozen in time, preserved in their chambers, each one waiting for a moment that never came. The survivor felt a mix of awe and dread as they looked at the soldiers. These were the warriors of the past, men and women whose very existence had been designed for one purpose: to fight, to survive, and to protect humanity. Yet they had been abandoned, forgotten in this tomb beneath the earth. The survivor walked closer to the nearest pod, staring at the soldier inside. The man or woman, it was hard to tell at first glance, looked almost lifelike, suspended in a deep sleep. The design of their armor and the enhancements visible beneath their skin made it clear they were more than human, more than mere soldiers. They were weapons. The survivor reached out, their hand trembling slightly. With a deep breath, they activated the machine beside the pod. The lights in the room flickered, and the cryogenic chamber hummed as it began to warm up. Slowly, the soldier inside began to stir, their eyes opening for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The soldier's eyes darted around the room, disoriented and confused. For a moment, it seemed as though they didn't know where they were, who they were, or what had happened. But then, slowly, the soldier's eyes locked onto the survivor. A sense of recognition flickered in the soldier's gaze. The survivor stepped back, unsure of what to do next. The soldier slowly sat up, their movements slow and deliberate. For a few moments, the two simply stared at one another. The survivor's mind raced. They had awakened this soldier, but now what? Was this soldier even capable of understanding the situation? Could they be trusted? The soldier's voice broke the silence. It was cold and mechanical, but there was an underlying humanity to it. "Where am I?" they asked, their voice low, but steady. The survivor swallowed hard, their throat dry. "You're in an old military facility," they said, their voice trembling slightly. I don't know how long you've been here, but you were frozen. I thought you could help us." The soldiers stood up, their expression unreadable. "Help?" they repeated, their mind clearly trying to process the words. "Who are you?" The survivor hesitated. I'm one of the last humans. There's nothing left of the world we once knew. We're barely surviving. I thought maybe you could—" The soldier cut them off. "You speak of survival. What of humanity's purpose?" They looked around, as if trying to grasp the weight of the situation. "You awakened me for a reason, didn't you?" "What is it?" The survivor nodded, feeling a mix of uncertainty and hope. "We need you. We need your strength, your skills. The world is in ruins, and there's no one left to save it but us." The soldier looked at the survivor, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion, something like sadness, crossed their face. "Then let's begin," they said, as they moved to stand beside the survivor. They had no choice but to trust each other, for they were the last hope for a dying world. And so, the first of the super soldiers had awoken. The future of Earth would now depend on what these long-forgotten warriors could do, and whether they still remembered what it meant to be human. The soldiers stood tall, their eyes scanning the dimly lit chamber with an air of cautious curiosity. The facility was cold, its walls worn and cracked by the years of neglect. Yet there was something unsettling about the stillness in the air. It felt as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something or someone to break. The silence. The survivor stood nearby, heart pounding, unsure of what would happen next. "Where are the others?" the soldier asked, their voice heavy with confusion and perhaps a hint of alarm. They had been alone in their cryogenic chamber for so long that the concept of others, of anything alive, felt distant, like a dream half remembered. The survivor, still nervous, but feeling a sense of urgency, motioned for the soldier to follow. "There are more of you," they said, leading the way down the dark hallways of the complex. You were all created, enhanced, to protect humanity. You were supposed to fight to save us. The soldiers' footsteps echoed in the silence, their mind racing with questions. The world they had once known was gone. They had been frozen in time, lost to history. And now they were being awakened in a world that was nothing like the one they had fought for. What had happened? How had the world fallen so far? As they walked, the survivor spoke quietly, filling in the gaps of the soldiers' fragmented memories. The Great War, had started long before the soldier had been put into stasis. The world had been ravaged by conflict, by resource shortages, and by the greed of those who thought they could control the planet. Humanity's leaders had built these super soldiers as a last-ditch effort to fight back, to preserve what little was left of Earth. But despite their best efforts, humanity had been defeated. The super soldiers had been created too late, and even their enhanced abilities couldn't save them from the inevitable destruction. Now, the soldier was learning the harsh truth. They had failed in their mission. Humanity had been lost, and the Earth they had sworn to protect was in ruins. The survivor stopped in front of another cryogenic chamber, its light flickering weakly. "Here," they said, their voice almost trembling. "You're not the only one. There are more of you here, more soldiers, like you. I thought maybe you could help." The soldier, still unsure of what to make of the survivor's plea, glanced at the chamber. The pod inside was similar to their own, yet there was something unsettling about it. It seemed so still, so lifeless, as if the soldier inside had been forgotten, left behind just like the rest. A sense of loss washed over the soldier, a feeling they couldn't quite explain. "Do you think awakening us will solve anything?" The soldier asked, their voice low. "Will it bring back the world we lost? Will it make things right again?" The survivor didn't answer immediately. They didn't have the answers. All they knew was that they had to try. "I don't know," they admitted, "but I have to believe there's a chance. We're the last ones left. There has to be something we can do." With a deep breath, the soldier stepped closer to the pod, placing their hand on its surface. "I was made for one purpose," they said, their voice quiet but firm. "To protect humanity. But now, there's no one left to protect." For a moment, neither the survivor nor the soldier spoke. The weight of the situation was heavy in the air, a feeling of helplessness that neither of them could escape. Yet, in the silence, something else began to stir, something deeper, something human. "I know you feel it too," the survivor said softly. "The world is gone, yes, but we're still here, and maybe that's enough. Maybe we can rebuild. Maybe we can still fight for a future." The soldier turned toward the survivor, their eyes searching for any trace of doubt or hesitation. They found none. The survivor's determination was clear, even in the face of such overwhelming loss. It was that same determination, that will. To survive, that had brought the soldier out of stasis in the first place. The soldier's gaze softened for a moment. "Maybe you're right," they said slowly, "but it won't be easy. The world we knew is gone. There are no more armies, no more governments, no more rules. We're going to have to make our own way." The survivor nodded, their eyes bright with a spark of hope. "I know," they said, "but we can start small. We can fight for what's left. We can rebuild, together." And so, they began the process of awakening the others. One by one, the soldiers began to stir from their cryogenic sleep, each one, emerging from their chambers with confusion in their eyes. Some of them were disoriented, unsure of where they were, or who had awakened them. Others seemed almost mechanical, as if their minds had been numbed by the long years of sleep. But slowly, the soldiers began to regain their senses. They were not just machines, they were living beings, each with their own thoughts, memories, and emotions. And though they had been created for war, they were not all the same. Some of them, like the first soldier, still held on to the belief that their mission was to protect humanity. Others, however, seemed more distant, less sure of what they were meant to do. The survivor did their best to guide them, explaining the situation as best as they could. The world had changed. Humanity was no longer the dominant force on Earth. Alien invaders had arrived, taking advantage of the chaos that had followed humanity's fall. These invaders had claimed large portions of the planet as their own, and now the remnants of humanity were left to fight for survival. As more soldiers were awakened, tensions began to rise. Some of the super soldiers were eager to fight, to reclaim what had been lost. Others, more cautious, questioned whether it was worth it. Was it possible to rebuild a world that had been so thoroughly destroyed? Was it even possible to stop the aliens who had taken control? The survivor could see the division growing. Some soldiers were becoming more and more focused on their original purpose, while others were beginning to question the need for such violence. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also human. And as time passed, the lines between what was right and what was necessary began to blur. Despite their doubts, the soldiers agreed on one thing. They needed a plan. They needed to know who these invaders were, what they wanted, and how to defeat them. The survivor, who had already seen the alien forces firsthand, led the group to a large terminal at the heart of the complex. The survivor had managed to salvage some old data from the facility's archives, and with the soldiers' help, they began to dig through it. What they found was chilling. The aliens were not just invaders, they were conquerors, seeking to reshape the world in their own image. They had advanced technology, far beyond anything humanity had ever created. And they were not here by accident. They had come to Earth with a clear purpose. "We need to stop them," one of the soldiers said, their voice low and filled with resolve. "We have no choice. If we don't, there won't be a future for anyone." The survivor nodded, a sense of determination growing inside them. The world was broken, yes, but maybe, just maybe, the soldiers of old could fix it. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be fast, but it had to start somewhere. And as the group of super soldiers gathered together, they made their decision. They would fight. They would protect whatever was left of humanity. For the first time in a long time, the survivor felt a spark of hope. They weren't alone anymore. They had allies, strong, capable allies. And together, they would find a way to fight back. But as the soldiers prepared for what lay ahead, they knew one thing for certain. The battle would not be easy. The world had changed, and they would have to change with it. As the days passed, the group of super soldiers settled into the complex, their presence beginning to stir the long-forgotten echoes of what humanity had once been. The facility, once a state-of-the-art military hub, now felt like a relic, a forgotten piece of the past. But it was their home for the time being, and they made the best of it. The soldiers, who had been designed for combat and leadership, fell into their roles. Quickly, some took charge of the facility's equipment, reactivating old systems to help gather resources, while others focused on training, preparing themselves for the coming battle. The survivor, who had once felt utterly alone in the world, now found themselves surrounded by the company of these formidable beings. Their presence was a constant reminder of both humanity's past mistakes and its lingering hope. The soldiers were more than just weapons. They were individuals, each with their own thoughts, memories, and struggles. Yet, despite the differences among them, they shared one thing in common: the belief that the world could still be saved. But the world had changed in ways none of them could have predicted. The alien invaders, who had descended on Earth during the final years of humanity's collapse, were unlike anything the soldiers had ever faced. Their technology was far superior to anything humans had developed, and their sheer numbers were overwhelming. The soldiers knew that defeating them would require more than just their enhanced strength and combat skills. They would need to think differently, to adapt to a world that had been reshaped by forces beyond their control. The survivor often found themselves in the midst of heated debates as the soldiers discussed their next steps. Some wanted to launch an immediate attack to take the fight directly to the invaders. They were warriors, after all, and it was in their nature to fight. But others were more cautious. They knew that charging headfirst into a battle without knowing the enemy's full strength would be reckless. They needed information, strategy, and most of all, patience. One evening, as the group gathered around a makeshift table in the facility's central room, the survivor spoke up. "We need to learn more about them," they said, looking around at the soldiers. "We don't even know what they're after, let alone how to fight them." A soldier who had been quiet for most of the conversation finally spoke, their voice calm but firm. "You're right. We've spent too long focusing on our power and our weapons. The world we left behind doesn't exist anymore. If we're going to survive, we need to understand our enemy." The survivor nodded, grateful for the soldier's insight. It was a sobering realization, but it was true. They had assumed that the same tactics that worked in the past would be enough to defeat the invaders. But the world had changed. The rules of war had changed. Now, they needed to think like survivors, not soldiers. The soldiers, despite their training and experience, found themselves facing a world that felt alien to them. The technology they had once relied on was outdated, and the environment was drastically different from the world they had known. Many of them were struggling to adjust to the new reality. For years, they had been frozen in time, waiting for a battle that never came. Now they had to contend with a new kind of warfare, one where knowledge, adaptability, and strategy would be just as important as brute strength. The survivors spent hours poring over old data from the facilities, archives, trying to gather as much information as they could about the invaders. They knew that the super soldiers' enhancements would give them an edge in battle, but it would mean little if they didn't know how to outsmart their enemies. What they discovered was unsettling. The alien forces had not only come to Earth. To conquer it was clear now that they had already begun to reshape the planet to suit their needs. They had set up bases in various parts of the world, constructing massive structures that seemed to blend with the environment. It wasn't just the technology that was advanced. They were changing the very landscape of Earth, altering it to fit their needs. Cities had been reduced to rubble, and forests, deserts, and oceans had all been altered by the invaders' presence. The most disturbing discovery, however, was the realization that the invaders were not acting alone. They had been in contact with other alien species, working together to advance their plan. The super soldiers had been created to fight a war on Earth, but now it seemed they were facing a much larger conflict, one that spanned across galaxies. "This is bigger than we thought," the survivor said, staring at the data on the screen in front of them. "We're not just fighting for Earth anymore. We're fighting for our place in the universe." The soldiers, who had been silent until now, exchanged glances. The weight of the situation was sinking in. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for a chance to rebuild, to reclaim a world that had been lost, and they weren't alone in this battle. The aliens were not just invaders. They were part of a larger network of forces that were working to reshape the galaxy. "Isn't just a fight for humanity," one soldier spoke up, their voice laced with determination. "It's a fight for everything we know." Another soldier, more pragmatic, raised a different concern. "We've been asleep for too long. We don't know what they've built, what their full capabilities are. If we attack blindly, we risk losing everything." The survivor sighed, knowing that both sides had valid points. The aliens were formidable, yes, but the soldiers' strength and determination were also undeniable. The survivor turned to the group, trying to find a solution. "We don't need to charge in blindly," they said, trying to calm the tension. "We need to gather information, scout their bases, learn their weaknesses. We need to be smart about this. If we rush into a fight without knowing anything, we'll just become another casualty of this war." The soldiers nodded in agreement, their minds beginning to settle on a plan. They had been trained for combat, but they also had the capacity to think strategically. They didn't have to rush into battle. They could wait, watch, and learn. Over the next few days, the group focused on gathering as much intelligence as they could. They used the facility's old communications equipment to tap into the alien networks, trying to uncover their plans. It was difficult, and the more they uncovered, the more they realized how deeply entrenched the invaders were in Earth systems. But the soldiers were determined. They spent long hours in training, preparing themselves not just for combat, but for the unknown challenges they would face. They knew that their enhanced abilities were powerful, but they also knew that they couldn't rely on them alone. They had to be prepared for anything. The survivor watched as the soldiers worked together, training, strategizing, and adapting to this new world. It was strange, seeing them work alongside one another, each of them learning to trust not just their own abilities, but the abilities of those around them. The soldiers had always been individuals, created for war, but now they were learning to work as a team, something that hadn't been necessary in the past. Days turned into weeks, and as the soldiers grew stronger, so did their resolve. They had a plan now, a strategy that gave them a fighting chance against the invaders. They weren't just relying on their power, they were using their minds, their ability to adapt, and their understanding of the world they were fighting for. One evening, as the group gathered to discuss their next move, the survivor couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. They had come so far in such a short time, and despite all the challenges they faced, they had made progress. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time since the world had fallen apart, the survivor believed that humanity had a chance. They weren't alone anymore, and with the super soldiers by their side, they had a fighting chance to rebuild what had been lost. The world had changed, yes, but that didn't mean it was beyond saving. The survivor knew that if they kept pushing forward, if they kept fighting, they might just be able to reclaim what humanity had once lost. And maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild a world that was worth fighting for. The days felt like weeks as the super soldiers and the survivor worked tirelessly to prepare for the battle ahead. It wasn't just about training anymore. It was about survival, about ensuring there was a future for the Earth, or at least for what remained of it. The facility they had claimed as their base had become a war room, with every corner filled with plans, maps, and makeshift equipment. The soldiers, once frozen in time and designed for combat, now had to adapt to a world that was far different from the one they had known. Each soldier had their own way of processing the situation. Some were eager, their need for action obvious, in their tense movements and the way they eyed the horizon, as if they were waiting for something to attack. They had been created for one purpose: war. But now, in this new world, they had to understand that war was different. It wasn't just about fighting, it was about surviving long enough to rebuild. They couldn't afford to rush into battle without understanding the enemy. Others were more cautious, their minds constantly calculating the risk of each decision. They had learned long ago that rushing into a fight without a plan only led to death. They knew that they couldn't afford to make the same mistakes humanity had made in the past. The aliens had far more advanced technology, and their numbers seemed endless. If they attacked blindly, they risked losing everything. The soldiers had seen enough to know that the world they had been made to protect was gone, and now they had to find a way to survive in this changed world. The survivor spent their days leading the soldiers, explaining the new dynamics of the world they were now facing. The alien invaders had not just come to conquer, they had come to reshape the world. Cities had fallen, and entire ecosystems had been altered. The planet had become a new battlefield, and every inch of it was contested. It was no longer just about fighting for survival. It was about reclaiming what was lost. It was about creating something new, something that could stand against the alien invaders and allow humanity to rise again. The super soldiers, despite their training, struggled to adjust. They had been created to fight, not to think about the bigger picture. But as they learned more about the invaders and the state of the planet, they began to understand. The survivor showed them old footage, images of the Earth before it had fallen into ruin. The soldiers saw cities that once thrived, forests that stretched for miles, oceans teeming with life. It was hard to believe that such beauty had existed, but the survivor insisted that it was still possible. The Earth was not entirely lost. Not yet. Look at it, the survivor said one day, pointing to a map that detailed the alien invaders. Territory. They've taken the cities. They've poisoned the land. But there's still hope. There are pockets of humanity left. There are places we can still fight for. One of the soldiers, a woman with a scar running across her face, studied the map carefully. She had been a commander in her previous life, and her tactical mind was sharp. If we're going to fight back, we need to focus on where we can hit them hardest. We need to be smart about this. We can't waste resources on battles we can't win. The survivor nodded. They had already learned that they couldn't afford to fight everywhere at once. The alien forces were spread out across the planet, their reach extending far beyond what the super soldiers had been trained to fight. But they were also vulnerable. The alien bases were heavily fortified, yes, but they were also spread thin. There were weaknesses, places where they could strike and cause the greatest damage. The survivor turned to the soldiers, their voice firm. We're not just fighting for Earth. We're fighting for the future, for the generations that could come after us. We have to take back this planet. It's the only way humanity will survive. The soldiers, still unsure about what their mission truly meant in this new world, looked at one another. The weight of their responsibility was heavy, but they knew they couldn't turn back. They had been made for war, but this was a new kind of war. A war for survival, for the future of everything that had ever been. As the days passed, the soldiers began to train harder, pushing their bodies and minds beyond their limits. They didn't just train in hand-to-hand combat and weapons use, they also trained in strategy. They had to understand the terrain, the enemy's tactics, and the resources they had at their disposal. They had to think like survivors, not just soldiers. The world was no longer the same, and neither could they be. The survivor's role, too, shifted. They weren't just a guide anymore. They were a leader. They were the one who kept the hope alive when the soldiers began to doubt. They were the one who reminded everyone that there was still something worth fighting for. As much as they had once feared being alone, they now realized that they had become the glue that held the group together. Without them, the soldiers might have fallen back into old habits, relying on brute strength and mindless violence. But with the survivors' guidance, they were becoming something greater than they had been designed to be. One morning, as the soldiers gathered to discuss their next move, the survivor noticed a shift. The soldiers were no longer just following orders. They were offering ideas, working together to create a plan. They were thinking beyond their mission. They were thinking about how to build a future. It was a small change, but it was a powerful one. The woman with the scar spoke up again, her voice steady. We've been operating in the shadows, gathering intel, but it's time. We know where the alien forces are concentrated, and we know where we can hit them the hardest. We take out their command centers. We disrupt their supply lines. We strike fast, hit hard, and then disappear before they can retaliate. The survivor nodded. The plan was risky, but it was their best chance. "We move at night," they said. "We'll need to be quick and silent. We hit them where they're weakest and then retreat before they can respond. We can't afford to stay in one place for long." The soldiers agreed. The plan was dangerous, but they had no other choice. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. Every day the invaders controlled the planet was another day they lost ground. The soldiers had to act, and they had to act now. That evening, as the sun began to set, the soldiers gathered their gear and prepared for the mission ahead. It was the first time they would truly be going into the heart of enemy territory, and the air was thick with tension. There was fear, yes, but there was also something else, something more powerful than fear. There was hope. Hope that they could make a difference, that they could do something to turn the tide of the war. The survivors stood at the front of the group, looking each soldier in the eye. "This is it," they said, their voice steady but filled with emotion. "We're not just fighting for Earth anymore. We're fighting for the future of all life. We're fighting to give humanity a chance to start over." The soldiers, each with their own thoughts, nodded. The survivor had given them more than just orders. They had given them a reason to fight. And in that moment, the soldiers weren't just warriors. They were protectors. They were part of something greater than themselves. As they moved out under the cover of darkness, the survivor led the way, their mind focused on the mission ahead. They knew the risks, but they also knew that without action, the world would remain in the hands of the invaders. This was their one shot, and they would take it. The battle ahead would not be easy. There were no guarantees. But for the first time since the world had fallen apart, the survivor felt a sense of purpose. They weren't alone anymore. They had an army of soldiers who, despite everything, still believed in the possibility of a better future. And for that, they would fight. The silence in the air was deafening as the soldiers moved through the darkened streets, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of the alien invaders. The mission they had prepared for weeks was finally underway. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the future of the Earth. They were deep behind enemy lines, and every step they took carried the weight of their entire species. The soldiers moved as one, their training and instincts kicking in. They had been designed to be perfect fighters, but this was different. This was not a battle where sheer strength would win the day. This was a war that required more than just power. It required strategy, patience, and understanding. The soldiers were learning to fight in a world that no longer followed the same rules as the one they had been created for. The invaders were not just enemies to be defeated. They were an entire force, with their own plans, their own motives, and their own vision for the world. The survivor led the group, their mind constantly running through the details of the mission. It was simple enough on paper: take out the alien command center, disrupt their operations, and retreat before the enemy could respond. But nothing in this new world was simple. They had no idea what kind of defenses the aliens had set up, or what new surprises might await them along the way. Every step felt like walking into the unknown, and yet the survivor felt a strange sense of calm. They weren't alone anymore. The soldiers had become more than just weapons. They had become a team with a shared purpose. The survivor had seen the soldiers change, seen them grow beyond their original programming. They were no longer just soldiers created for a single mission. They were human, in a way. They had learned the value of teamwork, the importance of trust, and the strength that came from working together. As they approached the alien base, the tension in the air grew thicker. The soldiers moved carefully, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. They had learned quickly that the aliens' advanced technology made them a dangerous force to face head-on. Every move had to be calculated, every decision made with precision. They were not just fighting to win, they were fighting to survive. And their survival depended on outsmarting the invaders at every turn. They reached the edge of the alien camp just before dawn. The base was heavily fortified, its structures towering over the land. Alien designs that seemed foreign and almost alien in every sense. It was clear that the invaders had done their best to make sure no one could get close without being detected. But the soldiers had a plan. They had been studying the aliens' movements for days, and they knew that this was their best chance to strike. The first soldier stepped forward, motioning for the others to follow. Each one of them knew their role. They had practiced this moment over and over in their minds. It was time to put their plan into action. The survivor watched the soldiers as they began to move. It was hard to believe that these were the same beings who had once been frozen in cryogenic pods, waiting for a war that never came. Now they were alive again, fighting for the future of the planet. Each one of them had a fire in their eyes that spoke of more than just battle. It was the fire of hope, the desire to do something bigger than themselves. As the soldiers infiltrated the perimeter of the base, they moved with precision, cutting through the enemy's defenses. It was clear that the aliens were not as prepared as they thought. The soldiers had the advantage of surprise, and they used it to its fullest. They moved swiftly, silently, striking down guards before they could even react. The survivor watched. The soldiers work, feeling a surge of pride. They had always known that these warriors were special, but now they saw it with their own eyes. These were not just killing machines, they were fighters for a cause that went beyond mere survival, a cause that could change the fate of the world. But the enemy wasn't going to make it easy. As the soldiers neared the heart of the base, alarms began to blare. The aliens had detected their presence. The survivors' window of opportunity was shrinking rapidly. The soldiers quickly adapted, shifting from stealth to full combat mode. They had been designed for this moment, their bodies enhanced to deal with situations just like this, firing with deadly precision. The soldiers took out alien soldiers and machines with ease, but the resistance was fierce. The aliens had numbers on their side, and they began to regroup, forming defensive positions to counterattack. The fight was quickly escalating, and the survivor could feel the tension building. This wasn't just a mission anymore. It was a battle for their very survival. The survivor shouted orders, trying to keep the soldiers focused on the goal. "Get to the command center," they yelled. "Take out their leaders. Disrupt their communications." The soldiers moved quickly, pushing forward despite the increasing resistance. They knew what was at stake. They had come too far to fail now. They reached the central command hub, a towering structure that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The walls were made of a strange metal that none of them had seen before, and the air hummed with the alien technology that powered the base. The soldiers moved with calculated precision, planting explosives at key points around the command center. They knew that destroying this facility would be a major blow to the invaders' plans, and they couldn't afford to waste any time. But as the explosives were set, a new threat emerged. A massive alien figure appeared in the doorway, its form towering over the soldiers. It was unlike anything they had ever seen before. Its body was covered in thick, armor-like plating, and its eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. It was clear that this was no ordinary alien soldier. It was something more, something powerful. The soldiers paused, their weapons trained on the creature. The air seemed to freeze as they faced off against this new, terrifying enemy. The survivor could feel the weight of the moment. They had come so far, but now they were facing something they couldn't have anticipated. The alien creature roared, its voice a low, guttural sound that shook the walls of the command center. It charged at the soldiers with terrifying speed, its massive fists swinging in deadly arcs. The soldiers scrambled to respond, their movements a blur as they tried to dodge the creature's powerful strikes. One of the soldiers, quick and agile, leapt forward, using their enhanced strength to land a blow that sent the creature reeling. But the alien recovered quickly, its resilience greater than they had anticipated. It was no ordinary warrior. It was the leader of the invaders, a force unlike anything they had ever fought before. The battle raged on, the soldiers fighting with everything they had. They were no longer just soldiers, they were survivors, and they would not go down without a fight. The survivors stood back, watching the chaos unfold. They had always known that this mission would be dangerous, but they hadn't expected this kind of challenge. Still, they couldn't let their fear control them. They had a mission to complete, and they wouldn't stop until it was done. With a final coordinated strike, the soldiers managed to take down the alien leader. It was a hard-fought battle, but in the end they succeeded. The creature fell to the ground with a deafening crash, and the soldiers wasted no time in finishing the mission. The explosives were set, and the command center erupted in a brilliant explosion, sending shockwaves through the base. The soldiers quickly retreated, racing back toward the exit as the entire structure began to collapse. The survivor watched as the alien base crumbled behind them, the sound of the explosion ringing in their ears. They had done it. They had struck a blow against the invaders, disrupted their operations, and given humanity a fighting chance. But the survivor knew that this was only the beginning. The war was far from over, and the road ahead would be long and difficult. But as the soldiers made their way back to the safety of their base, the survivor couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. They weren't alone anymore. They had the strength, the skills, and the will to fight. And together, they would continue the battle to reclaim their world. The alien invaders had underestimated humanity. They had underestimated the super soldiers. And now, they would know the true power of a species that refused to be defeated. The dust still hung in the air as the survivors of the mission made their way back to the hidden base, the place they had called home for what felt like a lifetime. The battle had been fierce. The explosion had rocked the ground beneath their feet, and the mission had been a success. But even as they walked away from the wreckage, the weight of what they had just done settled heavily on their shoulders. It was a victory, yes, but it was only one battle in a long, brutal war. The alien invaders weren't going to give up so easily. They had seen what humanity could do now, and they would adjust their strategy. The soldiers knew that. They had no illusions about what lay ahead. But even in the face of this, there was something different now. Something that hadn't been there before. The survivors, the soldiers once solitary warriors, trained only for combat, had become something more. They had become a team, a family. They had a purpose now that was greater than just surviving. They had seen the destruction of Earth, the fall of humanity. But they had also seen hope, the hope that they could rebuild, that they could stand together and fight back. The survivor who had led them through all of this walked ahead of the group, their minds still racing with thoughts of the battle, of the lives lost, of the victories they'd gained. There was a quiet strength in their steps now, a confidence that had been absent before. They had led these soldiers, these warriors who were once frozen in time, into battle, and they had come back with a win. But they knew better than to think that this was the end. The invaders would retaliate. It was only a matter of time. They reached the base and entered the familiar, dimly lit hallways. The soldiers who had stayed behind were waiting for them, their faces full of anticipation. When the doors opened, the soldiers who had been on the mission stepped inside, exhausted but triumphant. The others rose to their feet, eager for news of their success. "We did it," one of the soldiers said, their voice filled with relief. "The command center is destroyed. We've taken out their leadership. They won't be able to coordinate their forces for a while. There was a brief pause as everyone took in the gravity of the moment. It was a small victory, but it felt like the first real step toward reclaiming their world. The survivor nodded, but their expression was serious. "This is just the beginning," they said, their voice steady but full of purpose. "We've struck them, but they will strike back. We have to prepare for what comes next." The soldiers nodded, understanding the weight of those words. They weren't naive. They had seen how resilient the invaders were. They knew that even a major blow like this wouldn't be enough to turn the tide completely. But it was a start. And in a world where hope had seemed all but lost, that start meant everything. The survivor turned to the rest of the group, taking a deep breath. "We need to focus. We need to keep our momentum. This isn't the time to rest. We need to find more targets, more weak spots in their forces. We can't let up." One of the soldiers, the same one who had been skeptical from the beginning, stepped forward. They had always been more cautious, more thoughtful, and less eager for direct confrontation. "What do we know about their next move? Do we even know where they are? Or where they're going to strike?" The survivor paused, for a moment, considering the question. It was a valid one. They had gained valuable intel from the command center they had destroyed, but it wasn't enough. The invaders were a mysterious force. There was much they didn't know about their goals, their plans, or their overall strategy. But the survivor knew they couldn't wait any longer for answers. "We move forward with what we know." The survivor replied, "We scout, we gather more intelligence, and we hit them again. We don't wait for them to come to us. We make them play our game." The soldiers looked around at one another, some of them tired, others still brimming with that raw, unrelenting energy that had pushed them through the mission. They had tasted victory, and it was sweet, but they knew it was fleeting. The world was still broken, still in danger, and their fight wasn't over. Over the next few days, the soldiers worked together, scanning old data, using the limited technology. They had to track alien movements and pinpoint weak spots. They had no time to waste. With every hour that passed, the invaders were solidifying their hold on the planet. But the soldiers were relentless. They adapted, learned, and kept pushing forward. The survivors spent long hours going through old maps, trying to locate the remaining human strongholds, places where they could regroup, gather more survivors, and strengthen their ranks. But every time they found a new location, they would realize that it had already been overrun or was too heavily guarded to reach. It was a never-ending cycle of disappointment, but there was still something driving them forward, a sense of urgency, a sense of responsibility. These soldiers had not been created just to fight. They had been created to protect, to defend humanity from extinction. And although the survivors they found were few and far between, there were always more of them to save. Every life mattered now, and the survivor wasn't going to give up. Not when there was still hope. One night, after a particularly grueling day of scouting, the soldiers gathered around a fire. They were quiet for a moment, tired but reflective. The survivor sat with them, not as a leader, but as someone who had been through the same battles, the same struggles. They were all in this together, and that had become the most important thing of all. "We've come a long way," one of the soldiers said quietly, breaking the silence. "I didn't think we'd make it this far. After everything, after all, that's been lost. I thought it was hopeless. But here we are." Another soldier nodded. "I thought we were just weapons, created to fight and nothing more. But now I'm starting to believe in something bigger. I'm starting to believe in what we can do together." The survivor looked at each of them, seeing the fire in their eyes. It was the same fire that had been there when they first awoke, the same determination that had driven them forward through the darkest of times. These soldiers weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for a future. We're not just fighting for ourselves. The survivor said softly, their voice steady and full of conviction. We're fighting for the Earth, for the future, for everyone who's come before us, and everyone who comes after us. We fight because it's the only choice we have. We fight because we're human. The group fell silent again, but this time it wasn't the heavy silence of doubt or fear. It was the silence of understanding. The silence that came when everyone was in agreement. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were more than that. They were the last hope for humanity. And together, they would make it count. As the fire burned low, the survivors stood and motioned for the group to gather their things. The mission wasn't over. It would never be over until the last invader was driven off the planet. But they had made a start, and that start had given them a glimpse of what was possible. There were still many battles to be fought. The aliens were ruthless, and their control over Earth was deep. But the soldiers now knew that they weren't alone. They had each other. They had the strength of their unity, the power of their will, and the heart to fight for something bigger than just survival. With that thought, the survivor led the soldiers back into the night. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They would not go quietly. The war had just begun, and they would see it through to the end. Humanity had been broken, yes, but they would rise again. Together, they would reclaim their world.